All right, ready to dive deep. Today we're tackling 1 Corinthians 5.1:13.
It's intense, but really
It
fascinating.
is, right.
Yeah.
We're going to see how this story from the early church, it's a really specific situation.
Yeah.
It still has so much to teach us about, well, keeping things pure and honest in any community.
You know, what I find so interesting about this whole passage, it's not just like some abstract idea.
Right.
It's the Apostle Paul dealing with a real life mess, a sticky situation.
Yeah, for sure.
Something we can all relate to, I think.
Absolutely. And we're not just talking about spilled milk here.
Right.
This is serious stuff.
Huh.
This passage, it deals with sexual immorality
Right.
and a man living with his father's wife.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, even in ancient Rome, a culture that wasn't exactly known for, being uptight.
Mm-hmm.
This was a huge scandal.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It was way out of bounds, even for them.
Yeah, it really shows you just how serious this was.
Yeah.
Because even in a culture that was, let's just say, pretty relaxed about sexual matters.
Right.
Right.
This was like a hard line.
It was a line, they were like, nope, not that.
Yeah, yeah.
And, what makes Paul's response even more fascinating is he doesn't.
Yeah.
He doesn't mess around. He doesn't tiptoe around it.
No.
He just flat out calls them out, the Corinthian church, for being complacent, for not being more disturbed, really troubled by this.
Yeah, it's kind of wild when you read that,
Oh, yeah.
how casual the Corinthians seem about the whole thing.
Right.
You'd think they would be devastated, but they're almost like, yeah, we're good with this.
Yeah, they're almost bragging about it, right?
Yeah, it makes you wonder, right? How often do we do that today? Downplay things that should bother us,
Yeah.
especially within our own communities.
Mm.
Do we ever, I don't know, choose unity over addressing the hard stuff?
That is the question, and that's what makes this passage so powerful.
Mm-hmm.
Because Paul's basically shaking them, like, wake up, people. This is not something to be proud of.
Right.
This demands a response.
But it also points to a bigger issue that every community deals with. This whole balance between grace and accountability.
It's a tough one, right?
It is.
So, okay, how does Paul tell them to handle this? What does he say they should do?
He's pretty straightforward. He says they need to excommunicate the guy.
Wow.
To deliver him to Satan for the destruction of the flesh.
Okay, hold on. That's a lot.
It's a lot, right?
It's one of those verses that makes people, squirm a little.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
It sounds, I don't know, almost like vengeful or something.
Yeah, definitely.
What did Paul really mean there?
Well, that's where the context is so important, and really understanding Paul's language. Delivering to Satan doesn't mean, sending the guy to hell.
Oh.
It means taking him out of the church community, like removing that protection.
Okay.
The idea is to let him face the natural fallout of his actions.
The consequences.
Right, which can be physical and spiritual,
Right.
with the hope that this will wake him up, lead him to repentance.
I
The
get it.
goal is to shake him, help him see what he's done, and then ultimately bring about, a change of heart, reconciliation.
So it's less about, eternal punishment, more about tough love. Letting him hit rock bottom so he can find his way back.
Exactly. You got it.
Okay.
And that's where that phrase, destruction of the flesh, comes in.
Right.
It's not about God, zapping him or anything.
Right.
It's about the natural destructive power of sin. When we choose to live in a way that goes against how God made us, it always leads to brokenness.
Yeah. Yeah, I've heard that said, sin takes you farther than you want to go.
Right.
Keeps you longer than you want to stay, and costs you more than you want to pay.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
like allowing this guy to just keep going down that path without any, pushback, without consequences.
Yeah.
That's more harmful than being separated for a time.
And this is where Paul's image of leaven comes in, right?
Yes. Such a powerful picture. He's saying that just like a little bit of yeast can affect a whole batch of dough,
Right.
unaddressed sin can spread and it can corrupt a whole community.
Yeah. If you don't deal with it, it's going to have a bad influence on everybody.
Precisely.
It's such a vivid picture. And it makes you realize, this isn't just some small thing. This is a big deal.
It is.
We think of sin as a personal thing sometimes.
Right.
But Paul's saying it has a community impact,
Yep.
one bad apple, right?
A whole bunch, exactly.
Yeah. It's a good reminder that our actions, good or bad, they have ripples.
They do. We're all connected. Think about how relevant that is today. We see it all the time, right?
Yeah.
One person's toxic behavior can poison a whole workplace,
Oh, yeah.
ruin a family, even affect a whole society.
It's true. And it highlights the need for boundaries, for standards,
Yes,
and for actually dealing with things that can harm everyone.
Absolutely. You've got to address those issues head on.
Head on. So Paul also brings in the Passover in verse 7.
Yes, he does.
How does that connect to all this?
I think it's brilliant, the Passover connection.
Yeah.
He's drawing a parallel, right?
Yeah.
Between what's happening in Corinth and this Jewish festival where they were so careful to get rid of all the leaven in their homes.
Like a total spring cleaning?
Right. It was all about purification, a new beginning.
Yeah.
So just as they cleanse their homes of leaven, Christians are called to do the same thing with sin.
Cleanse their lives and community, you mean?
Exactly. Get rid of the corrupting influence of sin.
And for us, for Christians,
Yeah.
Christ himself becomes the ultimate Passover lamb, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Sacrificing himself
Yeah,
to free us from that bondage of sin.
that's it.
So Paul's saying just like Passover was this time for the Israelites to get rid of everything impure, so too should Christians be striving for purity and holiness in their lives, in their communities.
Yeah. And, you made a great point.
Yeah.
Paul's reminding them that their identity is now in Christ, who is purity and holiness. And this new identity, it demands a new way of living. It's not just about believing, the right things.
Yeah.
It's about living it out, showing the transformation that's happened because of Christ.
It's a call to action, to live out our faith in real, tangible ways.
Exactly.
But I mean, Paul isn't saying we should just isolate ourselves from the world.
Right. No.
He makes that distinction in verses 9 through 11.
He does.
What's he getting at there?
He's being very specific, and this is important.
Okay.
He's saying that Christians can't and shouldn't avoid contact with non-believers. People who might be doing all sorts of things that don't line up with Christian values.
Right.
That's just part of living in the world.
Yeah.
But within the church, within the community of believers, there's a different standard, a higher one.
So it's one thing to interact with people who aren't living by the same moral code,
Right.
but it's a whole other thing to tolerate that kind of behavior within the church itself.
Exactly. There has to be a line.
Right.
The church is meant to be set apart, not in a judgmental way,
Right.
not isolating itself,
Right.
but in a way that shows its core values, its beliefs.
And this is where the whole idea of church discipline comes in, right?
It does.
Holding each other accountable,
Mm-hmm.
helping each other to actually live out our faith, not just talk about it.
Yes, that's it.
And it's not about punishing people, but about creating an environment where everyone can actually thrive.
Yeah, you said it perfectly. It's about creating a culture where you can challenge each other, but lovingly
Yeah.
support each other's spiritual growth.
And recognize that sin hurts everyone, not just the individual.
Absolutely. It ripples out.
It does.
And that's what makes Paul's message so radical.
Mhm.
He wasn't afraid to deal with tough issues head on,
It wasn't.
to challenge the status quo.
Uh-huh.
And that's what makes this passage so relevant even today.
Even today, yeah.
We live in a world where it's so much easier to just avoid conflict, right?
Oh, yeah, way easier.
Or to shy away from difficult conversations.
Mhm.
But this passage, it's a reminder
Yeah.
that sometimes love requires us to be bold,
Mm.
to speak the truth, even when it's uncomfortable.
It's a good reminder that the church shouldn't be a place where we pretend everything is perfect,
Right.
but a place where we can be real about our struggles and support each other as we grow.
Yes, exactly.
So back to that tough instruction. Delivering to Satan.
Right.
Is this all about punishment in the end? Or is there something more going on there?
This is where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
And where we have to be careful not to misunderstand. Paul's crystal clear that church discipline, even excommunication, which sounds so harsh, it's not about revenge.
Okay.
It's not about inflicting pain.
So if it's not about punishment, then what is it about? What's the point of such a drastic measure?
The point is restoration.
Restoration.
Always. It's about bringing the person to a place of genuine repentance, reconciliation with God, with the community. It might seem harsh, but it's tough love.
Yeah.
Trying to wake the person up,
Right.
help them see the seriousness of what they've done and that they need to change. In the end, it's an act of love, not vengeance.
Yeah, I get that. It's like sometimes you have to let someone hit rock bottom before they're ready to turn things around.
Right, exactly.
And it's about like acknowledging that sin has power, it's destructive, and taking steps to protect the community while also, holding on to that hope that the individual can be redeemed.
That's exactly it.
It's about understanding that accountability can actually be an act of love.
Yes, it can be.
This has been so eye-opening already.
Yeah.
I'm seeing this passage in a whole new way.
That's great.
It's not just a bunch of rules.
No.
It's like a guidebook for building a healthy, thriving community.
I agree. And I think as we keep exploring this, you'll see how relevant these ancient principles still are today.
Oh, for sure.
Even in our world.
Well, I'm looking forward to diving deeper.
Me too.
But for now, let's take a quick break and come back to unpack even more of this amazing passage. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to our deep dive into 1 Corinthians 5.
I'm ready for more.
All right, so before the break, we were talking about this whole idea of church discipline.
Yeah.
And how Paul uses this image of leaven, like yeast,
Right.
to show how important it is to deal with sin in a community.
It's not an easy subject, but it's so important.
It's not, but it's crucial, right?
Yeah, for understanding how to actually build healthy communities, even today.
Absolutely. It's foundational.
It is challenging, but like we were saying,
Yeah.
it's not about being judgmental or condemning.
No, not at all.
I'm really interested in the practical side of this. Like, how do we actually apply these principles of church discipline in our own lives, in our communities?
Yeah.
Because it seems like such a different world than the one Paul was writing to.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is, right?
It's easy to read about this stuff, in the abstract, but then figuring out how to actually live it out
Right.
in our own messy, complicated lives, that's a whole other ballgame.
It is. And you're right, the world we live in now, I mean, it's a far cry from ancient Corinth.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
We have different cultural norms, different social structures,
Yeah.
a way wider range of beliefs and
For
values.
sure.
It's almost like comparing apples to oranges sometimes.
It can feel that way.
So how do we even start to bridge that gap? How do we take these ancient principles and make them relevant to our modern context?
Well, I think the first thing is to remember that even though the cultural landscape has changed, human nature hasn't.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, those basic principles, sin, accountability, grace,
Right.
the stuff Paul was wrestling with, it's still at play in our lives.
So you're saying that even though the specifics might look different, the core issues are still the same.
Exactly.
It's still about recognizing that sin has power, that we need each other to stay accountable, and that the goal is ultimately restoration, not punishment.
Yes, you got it.
Okay, that makes sense.
And that's what makes this passage so timeless, It speaks to something fundamental about being human.
Right.
It's about how we live together, how we deal with when things go wrong,
Right.
how we pursue healing and wholeness.
So even though we might not be dealing with the exact same situation as the Corinthian church,
Right.
the principles that Paul lays out are still incredibly relevant.
They are, I think, even more so today.
Okay, I like that. So if we zoom out a bit and look at the bigger picture, what are some of the key takeaways from this passage that we can apply to our lives?
Okay, well, I think the most important takeaway is this.
Okay.
Sin is serious.
Yeah.
It's not something to be taken lightly,
Right.
not something to brush under the rug.
Yeah.
Paul's reaction to the situation in Corinth, it makes that very clear.
He's not messing around.
He's not. It's a reminder that sin has consequences,
Right.
not just for the individual, but for the community.
It's so easy to fall into that trap of thinking, oh, it's just one person. It's not a big deal.
Right. It's just a small thing.
Yeah, but Paul's saying that even a single instance of unaddressed sin, it can have a ripple effect.
Yes, absolutely.
It's like a crack in a foundation. If you ignore it, it can bring down the whole house.
That's a great analogy.
Right. And that leads to the second big principle, accountability.
Yes, accountability.
Paul's calling the Corinthian church to take responsibility, right, for the purity and integrity of their community.
He is. He's challenging them to be proactive in addressing sin, not just for the individual, but for the well-being of the whole group.
It's about saying, hey, we're not going to tolerate this kind of behavior within our group because it will ultimately harm everyone.
Yeah, it's about drawing a line. It's setting a standard.
And creating a culture where people feel safe to call each other out,
Yes.
but also where they know they'll be supported and loved through the process of repentance and restoration.
That's a crucial point, Accountability isn't about being punitive or judgmental.
Right.
It's about creating a culture of love and support, but also a culture where sin is confronted and addressed in a way that leads to healing and growth.
It sounds like we're talking about finding that balance between grace and accountability.
Yes.
Between speaking truth and extending love.
That's it. It's not always easy.
It's not. It's a tough one.
It requires wisdom, discernment, humility.
A whole lot of
A
humility.
lot of humility, yeah. It's about knowing when to speak up, when to listen, when to offer a hand, when to step back, and let natural consequences run their course. It's a dance.
It is a dance, but it's a dance worth learning.
It is. It's a beautiful dance.
One of the things that I found really helpful in the source material was the emphasis on the purpose of church discipline.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
It's so easy to get caught up in the mechanics of it all.
Right.
Who's in, who's out. But the source material really highlighted this idea that it's not about punishment.
It's not about punishment for its own sake, no.
Oh, not at all. So if it's not about punishment, then what is it about? What's the driving force behind such a drastic measure?
The goal is always restoration.
Restoration.
Always. It's about helping the person who has sinned to turn away from that sin and find healing, reconciliation. It might seem harsh on the surface, but it's a form of tough love.
Right.
An attempt to wake the person up to the severity of their actions, their need for change.
It's ultimately an act of love, not vengeance.
You got it.
That image of the shepherd leaving the 99 sheep to go after the one that is lost is so powerful.
Isn't it?
It's a reminder that even when someone has strayed, they're not forgotten. They're still loved, they're still valued,
Yes.
and the community is willing to go to great lengths to bring them back.
That's a beautiful image, and it captures the heart of what church discipline should be about.
Yeah.
It's about pursuing that lost sheep with love and compassion, even when it's difficult, even when it's messy.
Because every single one is precious.
Every single one.
This whole concept of church discipline can feel really heavy and intense.
It can.
There's a lot of talk about sin and consequences, which can be intimidating, but there's also this thread of hope running through it.
Oh, absolutely.
This isn't about condemning people, it's about restoring them.
Yes.
It's about believing in the possibility of change and offering a path back to wholeness.
That's the heart of it. That's the good news.
It is. It strikes me that this whole concept of church discipline can feel really heavy and intense.
It can, yeah.
There's a lot of talk about sin and consequences, which can be intimidating, but there's also this incredible thread of hope running through it.
Oh, absolutely.
This isn't about condemning people. It's about restoring them.
Yes.
It's about believing in the possibility of change and offering a path back to wholeness.
That's the heart of it. That's the good news.
It is. It strikes me that this whole concept of church discipline can feel really heavy and intense.
It can, yeah.
There's a lot of talk about sin and consequences, which can be intimidating. But there's also this incredible thread of hope running through it.
Oh, absolutely.
This isn't about condemning people. It's about restoring them.
Yeah.
It's about believing in the possibility of change and offering a path back to wholeness.
That's the heart of it. That's the good news.
It is. It strikes me that this whole concept of church discipline can feel really heavy and intense.
It can, yeah.
There's a lot of talk about sin and consequences, which can be intimidating, but there's also this incredible thread of hope running through it.
Oh, absolutely.
This isn't about condemning people. It's about restoring them.
Yes.
It's about believing in the possibility of change and offering a path back to wholeness.
That's the heart of it. That's the good news.
Okay, so we've been talking about these big picture principles: sin, accountability, and restoration.
Right. The foundations.
Yes, and now I'm curious to dig a bit deeper into some of the specific language and imagery that Paul uses.
Okay, yeah, let's get into the details.
The source material provides a fascinating breakdown of some of the key terms and characters that I think can really help us understand the nuances of his message.
Oh, absolutely. Paul was a master of language, and his words are packed with meaning.
They are.
By exploring those key terms, I think we can unlock even deeper layers of understanding.
I agree. For example, there's the term fornication, which is used several times in the passage.
Yes, it is.
And the source material pointed out that this word has a broader meaning in the biblical context than it does today.
It does, yeah.
Can you explain that a bit?
Sure. Fornication, in the biblical context, it's a broad term.
Yeah.
It encompasses any sexual activity outside of marriage.
Okay.
It's not just about the specific act of incest that Paul's addressing in this case, but about any violation of God's design for sexuality.
So it includes adultery, premarital sex, any other form of sexual immorality.
Exactly.
It's about recognizing that sex is sacred
Yes.
and reserving it for the context of a committed, loving relationship within the covenant of marriage. And I think it's important to remember that God's design for sexuality isn't about being a killjoy or imposing arbitrary rules.
No, not at all.
It's about protecting us from harm and leading us to true fulfillment.
Yes, it's about recognizing that sex is powerful, that it creates a deep connection between people,
Mm.
and that it's meant to be experienced within a framework of commitment and love.
Right, and when we violate those boundaries, we open ourselves up to all sorts of pain and brokenness.
You do, not just individually, but relationally, even spiritually.
That's a good point. It's not just about following rules.
Right.
It's about understanding the wisdom behind those rules and recognizing that they're ultimately for our good.
Exactly. It's about living in alignment with how we were designed.
Right. The source material also highlighted the term leaven,
Yes, the lift.
which, as we've already discussed, is such a powerful metaphor for the corrupting influence of sin.
It is.
But I'm wondering if we can dig into that a bit more.
Okay.
What are some of the nuances of this metaphor that we might miss if we just skim over it?
You're right. There's a lot packed into this image. One thing that's interesting to note is that leaven, yeast.
Yeah.
It's hidden within the dough. You don't always see it.
Right.
But it's there, working its way through the entire batch.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
It's like how sin can sometimes be hidden within our hearts or within a community.
Right.
It might not be immediately apparent,
Yeah.
but it's there, slowly but surely spreading its influence.
Yes, I think that's a great analogy. And that's why it's so important to be vigilant, to be on guard against those subtle ways that sin can creep into our lives, our communities.
So we need to be aware of those seemingly small compromises,
Yes.
those little justifications we make, because they can lead us down a path we never intended to go.
Exactly. It's about being proactive,
Mhm.
about seeking to root out sin before it has a chance to take hold and cause damage.
It's about creating a culture where we're constantly examining our hearts and our community, asking ourselves, is there any leaven here that needs to be removed?
That's it. And that requires honesty, courage, a willingness to face those uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our communities.
It does, but it's so essential if we want to create a healthy and thriving environment.
Absolutely, no question about it.
This conversation about leaven and its hidden influence makes me think about another character in this passage that often gets overlooked, Satan.
Yes,
The whole delivering to Satan thing.
Right.
That's definitely one of the more challenging phrases in this passage.
It is. It's a head scratcher for sure.
It sounds a bit archaic.
Yeah.
Even scary. So let's talk about what does Paul mean when he talks about delivering someone to Satan?
It's a complex idea, and there's been a lot of debate about it over the centuries.
Yeah, I can imagine.
But essentially, it seems to refer to removing someone from the protective community of the church.
Okay.
And allowing them to experience the natural consequences of their sin.
So it's a recognition that sometimes the best way to help someone see the error of their ways is to let them experience the full weight of their choices.
Yeah, to let them feel the impact.
So it's not about God actively punishing someone or sending them to hell, but about letting them reap what they've sown.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that this isn't about being cruel or vindictive.
Right.
The hope is that this experience, as difficult as it might be, would lead to repentance and restoration.
It's kind of like a tough love approach.
It is. It's like sometimes you have to let someone hit rock bottom before they're willing to turn things around.
Right, exactly.
It's about recognizing that sometimes the most loving thing we can do is to step back and allow natural consequences to take their course.
It doesn't mean we abandon the person.
No, not at all.
But it does mean that we trust that God can work through even the most difficult circumstances
Yes, he can.
to bring about good.
That's the beauty of God's grace, isn't it?
It is.
It's always there, even in the darkest of places.
Mm-hmm.
Always working to redeem and restore, even when we can't see it.
That's a powerful thought. The source material also mentioned the destruction of the flesh.
Yes, another phrase that can sound pretty intense.
It does.
But it's important to understand that this phrase isn't about God being vindictive or cruel.
Okay.
It's not about him inflicting physical harm on someone.
Right.
It's about the natural consequences of sin. Remember when we were talking about leaven earlier?
Yeah.
And how it spreads?
How even a little bit can affect the whole batch. You were saying that sin is kind of like that.
Right, and destruction of the flesh is getting at the same idea.
Okay.
It's about recognizing that sin is inherently destructive. It always leads to some kind of brokenness, whether it's physical, emotional, or spiritual.
So it's not that God is actively destroying someone's flesh, but that sin itself is inherently destructive.
Exactly.
It's a consequence of choosing to live outside of God's design for us.
That's it. Sin always has a price tag.
It does.
And it's always higher than we anticipate.
Yeah, that's for sure.
And the destruction of the flesh is a way of describing the toll that sin takes on our lives, on our relationships, on our communities.
This whole discussion about sin and its consequences makes me think about the importance of forgiveness.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
If we're going to talk about confronting sin and holding each other accountable, we have to talk about forgiveness as well.
We do. Forgiveness is essential, both for the person who has sinned and for the community that has been hurt.
Right.
It's the only way to truly move forward and to experience healing and restoration.
But forgiveness doesn't mean condoning sin or pretending it didn't happen, right?
Right, you're exactly right.
It's not about sweeping things under the rug
No.
or minimizing the harm that was done.
Forgiveness is about releasing the bitterness, the resentment that we hold toward the person who has wronged us.
Okay.
It's about choosing to love them even when it's hard, even when we don't feel like it.
It's about recognizing that they are, just like us, flawed human beings in need of grace.
Yes, exactly.
And it's also about recognizing our own need for forgiveness.
Oh, absolutely.
None of us are perfect,
Yeah.
and we all need God's grace and mercy.
We do. We can't offer forgiveness to others if we haven't first received it ourselves.
Right.
We have to start by acknowledging our own brokenness and our need for God's grace.
This is all so profound.
It is.
And I'm sure it's raising a lot of questions for our listeners.
Oh, I'm sure.
We've covered so much ground, but there's still so much to unpack. For now, though, let's take a brief pause to reflect on what we've learned.
Okay.
And come back to continue our exploration in Part 3. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're wrapping up our look at 1 Corinthians 5:133, and it's been quite a journey.
It has, hasn't it? This passage really makes you think, about sin, accountability, and how to live purely in a community.
It's pushed me to examine my own heart, for sure, and how I interact with others.
Me too.
So we talked about a lot, that shocking case in Corinth delivering to Satan, the metaphor of leaven, Passover, grace, and accountability.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in.
It is. But the big question is, what does it all mean for us, practically? How do we take these ancient ideas and apply them today?
That's the challenge, right? It's one thing to get the history and the theology, but living it out, that's different.
Yeah, it feels like a huge leap from ancient Corinth to now.
It does.
Our world is so different from the early church. I mean, it's more diverse. There's so many different beliefs.
Right.
We don't always agree on what's right or wrong, or even what sin is anymore.
That's true.
So how do we navigate that? How do we hold each other accountable without, becoming judgmental or self-righteous?
It's a struggle for all of us, I think, and there aren't easy answers.
No.
But the principles we talked about, they can guide us.
Okay.
It starts with changing our perspective a little bit.
What do you mean?
Well, we often come at this with an us versus them mindset.
Oh,
Like,
yeah.
we're on the outside, judging those who are sinning.
Yeah.
But this passage, it says, hey, we're all in this together.
Oh.
We're all capable of sin. We all mess up. We all need grace.
So starting with that humility, remembering we're not perfect either.
Exactly. And that humility leads to grace and compassion.
Even when we're upholding truth, it's not about condemnation.
Right.
It's about helping them see the damage of sin, offering a way to healing.
So holding that tension, grace and truth.
Yes, both are essential. It's not either, it's both.
Like walking a tightrope.
It is. You need both to stay balanced.
Too much truth without grace, you become harsh.
Judgmental.
And too much grace without truth, you end up compromising, no accountability.
Exactly.
The source material has some really helpful questions
Oh, yeah, they were good.
about how to apply all this really practical stuff that got me thinking.
They were good. They really make you go beyond just talking about it to actually doing something.
Yeah, one that stuck out to me was, how can churches address sin without, throwing love and compassion out the window?
That's the tension, right?
It is. It's hard.
We want to be accepting and gracious, but we also have to uphold God's standards.
It's easy to go too far in either direction.
It is. You could be too lenient or too harsh.
Too lenient, you risk condoning sin, letting it grow. Too harsh, you become judgmental, legalistic.
And you drive people away from God's love.
Exactly.
It's about finding that middle ground.
that sweet spot, grace and truth coming together.
Yes, it's about creating a culture in our churches where sin is addressed, but in a way that's both loving and restorative.
Okay, so how do we actually do that? Create that kind of culture. It's easy to talk about, harder to do.
It is harder, but it starts with remembering we're all sinners, needing grace. None of us are perfect. We all fall short.
Yeah, it's humbling, isn't it? Reminds me, I'm not in a place to judge.
No.
I gotta come at this humbly, remember I mess up too.
Absolutely. And that humility leads to listening, understanding.
Yeah.
Before we jump to conclusions or solutions, we need to understand the person, their situation, listen with empathy, try to see their perspective.
Put ourselves in their shoes.
Exactly. There's always more to this story.
Right.
And once we've listened, understood, then we can offer support, guidance, right? Instead of saying, you should do this, it's more like, how can I help you through this?
Yes, exactly. What kind of support do you need?
Being a companion, not a judge.
That's it.
And realizing we can't always handle it all ourselves.
No. Sometimes we need to bring others in, a pastor, a counselor, a trusted friend.
Earlier you said the goal is restoration, not punishment.
Right.
Can you unpack that a bit more? What does that look like?
Well, first, remember, the person who sinned isn't the enemy.
Okay.
They're a child of God who messed up, just like we all do.
Right.
Our goal is to help them see their mistake, find a path back, not shame or punish.
A path back to God, back to community.
Exactly, believing in change, in redemption.
Even when it's hard.
Even then, it takes patience, love, forgiveness.
It does, but it's worth it.
It is. When someone who's strayed finds their way back, that's a celebration.
It really is. It shows God's grace at work.
It does. God's in the business of making things new, taking what's broken and making it whole.
So as we finish up this deep dive, I feel challenged but hopeful.
I do too.
Challenged because this passage calls for a higher standard. Holiness, accountability.
Right.
But hopeful because we're not alone. We have God's grace. We have each other.
I couldn't have said it better. Be courageous, be compassionate, hold to truth, extend grace.
Build communities where people can be honest, find support, experience God's love.
That's it.
This was such a great conversation. Thank you for your insights.
It's been a pleasure, really.
This passage will stick with me, and I think with our listeners too.
I think so too. It's amazing what you find when you dig into these old texts.
It is, and that's what the deep dive is all about.
It is.
So, to our listeners, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for being here.
Keep reflecting on this passage and think about how you can bring purity, accountability, and grace into your own communities.
Make a difference.
We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a new topic.
Always something new to explore.
Until then, keep seeking, keep exploring, keep diving deep.